everybody, it is Romania Black, teacher, coach, anime and manga enthusiast, and we are starting a brand new show today, The Apothecary Diaries. So, a quick side story, I originally had two shows that were ending around the same time on my channel, and I decided to have a poll to be like, okay, well, we'll take the top 12. I had like all these different recommended anime, all these different recommended shows, and there was like so many of them. I narrowed it down to like 25, and I was like, okay, I obviously can't do a poll of 25 options. So what I thought would be the most, best way to do the thing, it would be to have two polls of 6 each and then go from there. So I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. And so Apothecary Diaries was on the poll and it won by a landslide. Like a landslide. I was like, it wasn't even close. No. So I was like, well, do I put this on a poll with 5 other choices when it is clearly going to win? Or do I just go ahead and say, let's do the damn thing? I think there's a number of reasons that people chose this show. I've had a lot of recommendations for it on YouTube and Patreon, which usually indicates quality. I've also had a lot of people say that this show would be quote unquote right up my alley. We'll see where that goes. But also, I feel like it's not only new and it just came out this last fall into this year. I think the streaming service I'm watching it on says the original release date was October of 2023, so last fall. So it's fresh in everybody's mind, but they've also already announced that next year there'll be a new season. So I'm like, oh, okay, right about the time I'm finishing this season, the second season's gonna come out. All right. So that seems fair. So yeah, I'm excited about that. As you probably know, if you've watched my channel before, I start series blind. I have no clue what I'm expecting. I don't even know what genre this is. I know nothing about it. I've just had lots of recommendations, and I trust that patrons and subscribers here on YouTube know what they're talking about. So, which putting trust in a general population can often be a scary thing, but something you should know about my channel, if you're new to it, is that I will have the link down below to the actual reaction, and then I come back here and we dissect the episode, we talk about it. I don't claim to be an expert. I'm just an English teacher who also teaches speech and coaches a speech team, and I like to have fun on the side. So that's where we're at. But I hope you enjoy the reaction and the discussion. I'm excited to get into this show. It's fun to start a show that people are excited about. So other than that, I don't have anything to say except for thank you very much for supporting me and being here. Please, no spoilers. I do have a moderator that is going to go through the comments down below. I like to read comments. I like to respond to comments, but I don't want any spoilers of things I'm going to find out in the show as we go. So don't worry. If there's something I don't understand at first, the best thing to do is just let me figure it out on my own. And if we get to like the midway point of the season and I still haven't figured it out, then definitely let me know in the comments and my moderators will check and make sure it's okay for me to read. But I don't read any comments that the moderators don't approve. I just heart them so they get out of my inbox. So if you don't see a response to me, that means that there's a spoiler in your comment. So be careful of that. But otherwise, I'm super excited. I can't wait to dive in and let's see what we get. So I woke up this morning, grabbed myself a cup of coffee and was like, you know what? I feel like it's time for Apothecary Diaries to start this journey. So let's not waste any time. We're going to start episode 1 of the Apothecary Diaries and see what we get. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. Well, damn. I didn't bring Whiteboard Coon out for this episode, but I have a lot to talk with you all about before we even dive into the episode, because I was like, oh, this is not quite in my historical wheelhouse, and it's also a Japanese anime taking from Chinese history, so I'm like, we're going to need to back up just a hot second with it. But before we start this, the voice actor for Jinshi, I love his voice. His voice so far, I'm like, ooh, hello. And it almost felt like, I was like, this isn't Ash Lynx, but it kind of has that same timbre to it. And I was like, whose voice is this? So I looked him up. His name is Takeo Otsuka. He is a very recent voice actor. He's not insanely popular yet. I hope he's become popular because of Jinshi, because I'm like, yes, please. But the only voice actor role that I know that he's done so far is he played, I've watched Beastars season 1. He was Cullet and Tim in that one. and then he was Lucian Atwood in Moriarty the Patriot. Those are the only roles that I know him for, but his voice is it's like butter. It's very velvety. So yeah, the patriarchy, am I right? So we're going to talk about this episode. I know that throughout the reaction, I'm sure a lot of people will complain in the comments that I kept saying, why doesn't she just go home? And I get it's like a Mulan situation. She can't go home. She was taken by kidnappers and sold to the Imperial Palace. She can't just run away. Once you're in the Imperial Palace, you're there. She says like a 2-year indentured servitude situation, which is interesting to me. I haven't looked up that portion of Chinese history. I'm not even sure which era we're in technically, which dynasty we're in. But here's the thing. It feels like an amalgamation of all of them kind of mixed together, and we don't want to differentiate one specific one, so we'll see as we go. I've got a lot about concubinage and eunuchs I want to talk about that I've done a little like basic, and I mean like bare bones, skimming the surface research on, but I want to talk about that before we get into this episode. But I think for me, the only mild critique I have as we move into this episode was how chill Mao Mao was with getting human trafficked. I was like, girl, you act like this is just, damn it. I got human trafficked into an imperial palace for 2 years. My dad seems old. I won't be able to see him. Hope he's doing okay. I'm like, girl, you're like the chillest kidnapped victim ever. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, I want to look up, did a man write this or did a woman write this? Because I feel like that's going to make a difference for me. Let me see. Apothecary Diaries. I just want to know the author. The author by Natsu Hyuga. Natsu Hyuga. I want to find out. Where is this? Illustrated by Toko Shino. Okay, so it was basically a light novel series. Okay. I want to see. Is Natsu Hyuga a Japanese light? She. Okay, so it is a woman that wrote this. All right. I mean, I do think that makes a difference. I know some people will be like, oh, that doesn't make a difference. I think it does. When a woman writes female main characters versus a male writing them. So, and there's also a lot of elements to this story already that I'm like, okay, all right, I'm into this. I'm ready for this, and we'll talk about it as we go. But I want to point out very first and foremost, this is the first anime that I've watched that has the disclaimer. And the disclaimer is, this story is a work of fiction. The names of all characters, organizations, and so on are imaginary. It also bears no connection to any specific real-life events. That disclaimer is basically to cover up that it bears resemblance to real-life events. That is their legal disclaimer saying, please, Chinese government, don't sue us or cancel us because we're going to talk about your history. That's what that says. And the reason why I say that is when I grew up, I read, and this is just a random reference, but I read Sonic the Hedgehog. It was Archie comic series. And there was a writer for that series called Ken Penders, and he has a bunch of controversy around him. I love and hate him at the same time for reasons that I'm not going to go through in this video, but you can comment down below if you're a Sonic the Hedgehog fan and we can talk about it. But the main thing was he did a lot of story development for that series that when growing up, I loved. I was like, oh my gosh, yes. But I noticed as I read that series, a lot of the story development things involved characters from other series it was a little pseudo plagiaristic elements. But he made it his own through Sonic, and I was like, okay, but it had that disclaimer too, being like, oh, these are just in no way, shape, or form related to real life characters' events. It's just a random coincidence. And then growing up, as I got older, I started seeing those references and being like, oh God, he was just blatantly like ripping those off and adding them to his story. But here where they're like, we're going to talk about eunuchs and concubinage and outdated practices in Chinese culture. Please don't sue us. Is basically what that says. Because I'm like, you directly tap into Chinese culture for this series. You say that you have no specific connection to historical events. I'm going to call you out, show, on that, but it's fine. It's just hilarious to me that they have to put that disclaimer there, right? And specifically because it's going into the culture. Here's the thing, like Yona of the Dawn, for example, doesn't derives a lot from Asian cultures, not just Japanese, but they don't have a disclaimer like that. But they're not diving into topics like concubines and eunuchs that are a little bit controversial that they would need to have that disclaimer for. That's fascinating to me. So let's talk about Mao Mao before we get into the whole eunuchs and concubine conversation. I like Mao Mao a lot. She very much is very nonchalant. She's very nonchalant, which I think what's interesting is that she has a very old father. And so, which, you know, her father is very elderly. So that's interesting to me. I'm assuming that's her actual father. He seems like he's blind based on how his eyes are drawn. So they don't have the light in them. So I feel bad for him because she's been kidnapped and he has no clue. I'm sure he's guessed what's happened to her. But he's like, oh, be careful. Kidnappings are on the rise. And she's like, oh, no big deal. I'll be fine. No, she was not fine. It was honestly the least, and I say this praising it. It was the least like confrontational, conflictional kidnapping of a character. And I think what it is I am so used to male written scenes of trafficking and kidnapping that are sexually exploitive that I was just expecting her to get assaulted. I was expecting her to be, you know, manhandled, and she wasn't. I was like, oh, here's a woman writing that scene. Look at that. So yeah, I was like, she's like, here we are. There's nothing I can do about it. And it was refreshing seeing that compared to some other series that I'm currently reading and have been watching. It was refreshing. And I feel like I almost got defensive because I was like, well, why is it happening this way? Why? Because I'm so used to a structure where the female character is exploited and everything like that, that it was like almost jarring to see a situation where it wasn't that. And now looking back, I'm like, oh, we can write those scenes? Oh my God. So I was having a good time with it in hindsight, in retrospect. But I like Mao Mao's character. She's very chill. But she also is like, what's fascinating for her as a female protagonist is that she comes across very aloof, and she just also like, she's smart. She's literate, she's smart, she knows her she knows her stuff, but she is very much kind of opposing the gendered structures around her. Like all the other women she knows are either servants who are not literate and not given the same opportunities as the male counterparts in her society, or they're concubines with big old breasts that are just sexually objectified, and she doesn't fit in either category. So she's kind of this little oddity, this entity that exists outside of the gendered constructs of the patriarchal system that she's been brought up in. And I like that. It puts her in a very weird position, so maybe she has no choice but to be nonchalant. She's like, if I just keep a low profile, that's all I have to do. If I just keep under the radar, I won't be subjected to the same persecution that these other women around me are subjected to. Which is why at the end she's like, shit. And towards the end of the reaction, I kind of started to see where she was coming from, that she was like, oh God, if I get up here in this concubine's like lading and waiting status, and I get up here, one, I may not be out in 2 years. I may be forced to stay here longer than that. My dad's old. I'd really like to get back to him. And two, she's like, a woman that's intelligent and able to work her way up in the society is going to be a target. And I don't want to be a target for being harmed. So I get where she's coming from. I'm like, oh girl, I get it now. By the end of the episode, I was like, oh, this structure, this is not looking good for you. I want to talk about just, it's so interesting to me to see this world building and for it to be, because I've read and watched a few Danmai right now. I've seen Heaven Official's Blessing. I'm currently looking at Scumville and Self-Saving System, and I've seen Modao Zushi. And they're all kind of fantasy series that deal with like ancient China. I've watched Link Click too, but that's modern, so that's a different thing. But so seeing a Japanese take on the Chinese aesthetic in fantasy is very intriguing to me. It feels almost, it's weird to say it's nostalgic, but it kind of is. I guess I was getting a lot of Modao Zushi vibes watching this episode, especially with the concubines, the lady in waiting and all of that. It's interesting. Very much so. Again, the Donmai that I've seen are also written by women, so that aesthetic, seeing it from that female lens and that female gaze, is a definitely it's definitely different, right? But I love the idea of this concubine house, the men all coming up to get the medicine and also to see the women in the house. Like, I like that it's sort of like these women playing the system. They're like, we're stuck in this patriarchal system, which sucks, but we're going to make the most of it and try to like bend these men to wanting us and needing us. And I'm like, yes, make lemonade out of lemons, girls. I also find it interesting that we have, Mao Mao, she can come to appreciate the concubines and work with them because she's used to seeing them in her own town. So there's that connection there. I'm a little bit worried about a little wee bit worried about this wound that she has on her arm that's not gotten better. That's like she's been testing poisons on herself. She very much gives me a Sherlock vibe in the regard of her testing the medicines and poisons on herself. I'm like, girl, I don't know if I like this kind of self-harm of you using yourself as a human guinea pig, but I'm curious to see where that's gonna go. And then, yeah, just seeing her kind of subvert from these gender roles where she's not like you see that one image of the women all helping the other women get ready and tying their dresses. They all have the same hairdo, the same updo. It's like cookie cutter. And then you have Mao Mao, who's a little bit different. And I wonder, she talks about how she's not, likely to be a lady in waiting or a concubine because she has like the freckles. And I know freckles have constantly, like, I always liked freckles. I like the idea of reclamation of freckles as being something that's a positive, because for women throughout history, freckles were always like a beauty standard, that it was like a mark. Like, it almost seemed like a blemish on your face and something that took away from your beauty, which Mao Mao seems to believe that. And also the fact that she doesn't have, a large bosom, which girl can relate. It's like, yeah, the traditional stereotypical patronized view of beauty is this blemish-free face, pale skin, big boobs, all this, that are not representative of the majority of the population. And I can definitely see why she feels like she's not up to the standard of beauty that is expected of her culture. And so, again, her like talking about how it's taking too long to heal. I hope that Jinshi like talks with her about that, about her using herself as a human guinea pig. We'll see where that goes. But her being apothecary, I liked all of the concubines in the one house. Like, she's like, I'm doing these drug experiments, and them just trying to like comfort her and being like, hey, are you taking care of yourself? You should probably not do these experiments. They're probably hurting you, whatnot. But I like the one woman that leads the concubine house. She's just like, say hi to your old man for me. I was like, did you guys have a thing? Really? We're going to talk about her mom here in a little bit. But her mom's this old hag's trying to make me a courtesan. And then she's like, I'd rather not do that. So I like Mao Mao being like, no, that's not for me. No thanks. I'd rather be an apothecary. I like the idea of this woman character wanting to do a traditionally male career role in this culture. So I think that's nice. But yeah, so we have these guys. For all the authors out there that are writing manga and anime, if you're going to have a female character kidnapped, you can just have her kidnapped like this scene. That's all you have to do. I was expecting more. I was expecting the worst, and I'm pleasantly surprised that didn't happen. Oh, there we go. You can do it. I believe in you. So yeah, she's like, I hope that my dad isn't worried as she gets taken to the Imperial Palace. So you know what? Going into this idea of the concubines and the princes and the eunuchs and everything, all I can say is, patriarchy, what we doing? I love that years back there was this argument in my own country about a woman being a leader, and they were like, women, just all the hormones and stuff, like they'll just make irrational decisions. And I'm like, have y'all seen how fucked up history is with the men in charge? I'm like, y'all, I'll take a matriarchy any day. At least most likely the men will be able to keep their penises. It's so messed up. It's so messed up. And here's the messed up part of it. So I did a little basic research about concubinage and eunuchs in China because I know nothing about them. And again, this is like surface level. We're talking like Wikipedia surface level. I'm sure people in the comments will have a lot more to discuss about it. But the idea of, so the emperor in this story does not have a wife. He doesn't have a queen. There is no consort. So instead, he's got like kind of his concubines and waiting in the back having his kids, which I think is interesting and, to my knowledge, rare. So it almost, here's the thing, and I'm going to say this, I guess I'm not trying to say this in a bad way, but it seems like it makes the emperor, which, here's the thing, the concept of one man constructing an entire series of palaces filled with castrated men because he doesn't want them having the possibility of impregnating any of the women in his household unless he's able to do it. It's a level of patriarchal machismo that's like, wow, okay. But having said that, I feel like the story in having the emperor not have an official wife is almost, in my mind, trying to make him seem like a better person. That, oh, he's just with these, he's just got like it's polygamy. He's just got like a harem of wives. It's like, it's Mormon. It's like, whatever. He's just got a bunch of wives. It's fine. They're all equals. And I'm like, are they? So it just almost makes it seem like they're trying to make the emperor in a better light. The fact that he just has an equal set of wives rather than a bunch of mistresses in the background while his one wife like suffers in the shadows is kind of what it feels like to me. And the emperor, since we haven't met him at all, we don't know how he's portrayed in this. We'll be curious, but the history of concubinage is interesting, saying in pre-modern China it was illegal and socially disreputable for a man to have more than one wife at the time, but it was acceptable to have concubines. Double standards all around, right? The patriarchal double standards are abound. From the earliest times, wealthy men purchased concubines and added them to their household in addition to their wives. Why? It's just insane. It is insane how history has been. Am I right? Insane. So basically, concubine treatment in situations were variable and influenced by the social status of the men that she was attached to. In the Book of Rights chapter on the pattern of the family, if there were, quote, betrothal rights, she became a wife. If she went without those, a concubine. Wives brought a dowry to a relationship, but concubines did not. Concubinage relationships could be entered into without ceremonies used in marriages, and neither remarriage nor a return to her natal home in widowhood were allowed to a concubine. So yeah, I could see why Mao Mao would not want to become one, because she can't go back home. It's like, no, who would want that? And so basically, here's the thing. The position of the concubines generally were viewed as inferior to a wife, but there is no wife in this case. So it almost seems like the concubines are kind of on an equal playing field. There's no like woman above all of them. And it says the child of a concubine had to show duty to two women, their biological mother and their legal mother, the wife of their father. So it's like, but there is no other mother here, so there's not that situation. It's like the author didn't want to get into that yet. So, which is going to be interesting if he takes on an actual empress consort, if that relationship dynamic's going to change. So far, it's like the author didn't want to deal with that, so they were like, we got enough to worry about. Let's just not bring that into this. It says, after the death of a concubine, her sons would make an offering to her, but the offerings were not continued by the concubine's grandsons, and so on and so forth. There's like a whole history of it. It said during the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1911, it's a long dynasty, the status of concubines improved. It became permissible to promote a concubine to wife if the original wife had died and the concubine was the mother of the only surviving sons. So I'm wondering if we're going to get into that, the fact that there is no wife if one of these concubines are vying to become queen legally and have her child, her son, take the role. Now, right now, the one woman who looks like Milotech in human form, she doesn't have a son. She just has a daughter. So, whereas the other concubine, she had a son. So she's like, oh, maybe I'll get promoted. But it seems like the emperor likes the concubine with the daughter. So there's this political strife as far as that goes. Moreover, The prohibition against forcing a widow to remarry was extended to widowed concubines. So now concubines don't have to remarry. During this period, tablets for concubine mothers seem to have been more commonly placed in the family ancestral altars, and genealogies of some lineages listed concubine mothers. Many of the concubines of the emperor of the Qing dynasty were freeborn women from prominent families. Concubines of men of lower social status could be freeborn or were slaves. So they could just kind of like choose to be a concubine to marry into that. Imperial concubines kept by emperors in the Forbidden City had different ranks and were traditionally guarded by eunuchs to ensure that they could not be impregnated by anybody but the emperor. In Ming China, 1368 to 1644, there was an official system to select concubines for the emperor. The age of the candidates ranged mainly from 14 to 16, which is a choice. Virtues, behavior, character, appearance, and body condition were all selection criteria. So, which makes Mao Mao, when she says she doesn't want to become a concubine or a courtesan, it makes sense. She's probably, I assume that Mao Mao's like 16. That's the age I was guessing for her. So, in that 14 to 16-year-old age range. And despite the limitations imposed on Chinese concubines, there are several examples in history and literature of concubines who achieved great power and influence. And this is what reminded me of this series particularly, saying that Lady Yehinara, otherwise known as Empress Dowager Cixi, was arguably one of the most successful concubines in Chinese history. Cixi first entered the court as a concubine to the Zhongfeng emperor and gave birth to his only surviving son, who later became Tongji emperor. She eventually became the de facto ruler of Qing China for 47 years after her husband's death. So I thought that was interesting that this concubine came up and became essentially the ruler of China for 47 years, which is crazy. The most crazy part about all of this, though, is the idea, we go down to social status, it said that basically, what did we get on here? It said that concubines, it said Hong Kong, concubinage was illegal around like the 40s to 70s. That's not long ago. That's not that long ago at all. I was like, that's like when my parents were born. That's insane. That's insane. I'm like, what? It said that the practice of concubinage in China was outlawed by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. That's less than 100 years ago. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. So then we'll discuss the whole thing about eunuchs here in a second, but that whole idea of the concubines, and so these two women vying for power to try to like get in the emperor's favor. The one woman with the blue hair, and we don't get to see the emperor, but both their kids look like them, so it's like, is he gonna be like the most bland person imaginable? Seriously, the one concubine, she looks like Milotic from Pokemon if she was given a human form. And the other woman, interesting. I feel bad for her. Like, the scene of her son dying and her screaming, that was intense. That was maybe the most intense real part of this episode, that I was like, oh, this show's not afraid to go there. Like, we had a very chill human trafficking 5 seconds ago, but then the child dies and it's like, oh my god, like, insane. So Mao Mao is like, I'm getting paid, I guess, which I didn't realize the servants there got paid, so I guess there's that. The indentured servants, they get paid. They're stuck there for 2 years. They're in a nice, safe facility. She's like, I just got to keep my head down low, and I'll get through these 2 years, and I'll leave. And that's all I got to do. But obviously that's not going to happen from here. She's like, I don't know if I was sold off or ransomed, but it's already been 3 months, annoyingly. The palace and the brothels are very similar. And she's like, what can I do now that I'm here? And so she talks about how the rear palace is the garden of women who are to give birth to the emperor's children, right? And she's like, no men are allowed to enter. The only people allowed here are the emperor, his kin, and eunuchs, formerly male individuals who lost an important part of their body. It's a huge collective of 2,000 concubines and servants and 1,000 eunuchs. Now, I don't think that there are, it says 2,000 concubines and servants. I think there's definitely more servants than anything, and just, some concubines. Which, whatever. its history. I want to talk about eunuchs though. There's a small passage on eunuchs in here and kind of like how they've been throughout the dynasties. There's like a whole big segment on them. The fact that we don't exactly know what dynasty this anime is drawing from could be a lot. It kind of seems like an amalgamation of them because the author doesn't want to be too specific. Again, we're not referencing any specific time or place in history. So I just did like a basic search about eunuchs in China. A eunuch is a man who's been castrated. Throughout history, castration served as a special social function. In China, castration is the removal of the penis as well as the testicles. Everything goes. Both organs were cut off with a knife at the same time. Vasectomy, you know what? If a vasectomy had been possible back then, I think a lot of guys would have been happier. But sadly, no vasectomies there. We're just going to chop the whole thing off. I guess you can reverse a vasectomy, so they're like, well, we're not going to have any chances of that happening. But what was interesting to me was eunuchs have existed in China since about 146 AD during the reign of Emperor Huan of Han, and were common as civil servants by the time of the Qin dynasty. From those ancient times until the Sui dynasty, castration was both a traditional punishment, which is what I would think of, and this part got me, a means of gaining employment in imperial service, which seems to be Jinshi's route. When I looked at Jinshi, I was like, you don't seem like somebody who was punished by becoming a eunuch. You seem like you chose this. And yeah, certain eunuchs gained immense power that occasionally superseded that of even grand secretaries, such as the Ming Dynasty official Zhang He. Self-castration was a common practice, although it was not always performed completely, which led to it being made illegal. So some guys were like, they were willing to chop it all off, being like, I don't want kids, chopping it all off so that they could get into a position of power. Patriarchy, y'all, what are you men doing out here? But it was seen as it was said that the justification for the employment of eunuchs as high-ranking civil servants was that since they were incapable of having children, they would not be tempted to seize power and start a dynasty. As long as we can't bear heirs, who would do that? But we'll talk about that here in a second. In many cases, eunuchs were considered more reliable than the scholar officials. As a symbolic assignment of heavenly authority to the palace system, a constellation of stars was designated as the emperor, and to the west of it, 4 stars were identified as his eunuchs. So yeah, this idea that, yeah, you can work up the ranks because you're not a threat to me and my monarchy and my dynasty, my blood heirs. I'm like, that is so wild, right? So wild. As if your penis dictates whether you're power hungry or not. I'm like, that's insane, right? But then there's like tale as old as time, the idea of bloodlines and lineages and your family carrying on your legacy. It's like, it's just insanity. But the tension between eunuchs in the service of the emperor and virtuous Confucian officials is a familiar theme in Chinese history. In History of the Government, Samuel Feiner points out that the reality was not always that clear-cut. There were instances of very capable eunuchs who were valuable advisors to the emperor, and the resistance of the virtuous officials often stemmed from jealousy on their part. Ray Huang argues that in reality, eunuchs represented the personal will of the emperor, while the officials represented the alternative political will of the bureaucracy. The clash between them would thus have been a clash of ideologies and political agenda. So yeah, the idea that the eunuchs are like, well, we have nothing to gain, so we're representatives of the emperor's will. We're totally cool in this. And then the officials who can have a legacy and carry on their bloodlines being representative of the country's bureaucracy. It's like, that's so intriguing to me. And we'll talk about Jinshi's character in a little bit. But the number of eunuchs, this part also like blew my mind, y'all. The number of eunuchs in imperial employ fell to 470 by 1912, which was just about 100 years ago, with the eunuch system being abolished on November 5th, 1924, 100 years ago now. The last imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, died in December of 1996. That's not that long ago. That's not that long ago at all. So it was just like, I was like, oh, you think of stuff like this happening historically, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but this all is like relatively recent. So it's so insane to me. But we'll talk about Jinshi here in a little bit. So yeah, so unlike the high, mid, and low ranking concubine, servant girls are expendable and can lose their lives at any moment. Which is why I was like, okay, so that explains why Mao Mao is very much trying to keep her head low. She's like, I don't want to get involved in this. I don't want to, get to where I'm noticed because I could lose my life. She's like, next in line are the shut-in and low-ranking concubines, which kind of remind her of the ones she saw back at the shop she went to do her apothecary business. I like that she has the little beads that are blue and red, showing like the two sides. This one girl who kept saying, "Did you hear all these rumors?" She reminds me of like a character from Hanako-kun, honestly. And she's like, most of these girls cannot read or write because again, it's all a power structure, right? This emperor who seems legit also has created a structure where no men can have any sex with the ladies and no ladies can read or write. So it's very much limiting the opportunities of anybody in this system to be on par with the emperor. It's very deliberate, right? And Mao Mao, I can kind of see now, looking back at this episode, why she would be worried. She's like, oh shit, I am a literate girl. I'm in a very dangerous predicament here. I got to keep my head low. But she has a smidgen of justice. I love the smidgen of justice that she's like, I just can't let these women and their kids go without trying to help them in some way. She does make the note that even servants could become low-ranking concubines, but she does not seem to have the qualifications to be in that position, which I'm kind of glad. I like the idea that she's subverting gender expectations and she's kind of going against the grain. I would not want her to become a concubine because we'll talk about her and Jinshi's relationship here in a little bit. I'm like, girl, you don't need that. Like, I want her to work her way up through a traditional male expectation role, like being an apothecary. I'd rather have that. She's like, if I stood out, my life would be at risk. I'm just better lying low. I just got to work hard and I'll be out in 2 years. But from there, we see the whole deal about the two concubines and their sons being sick. So then we have Jinshi, who is the rumored very, very handsome eunuch, who I believe, I'm curious about Jinshi because he's very, very handsome. I'm assuming he actually is a eunuch. I don't think he's lying. I assume he's not. I think it'd be very easy for them to tell if he was lying. But I'm very curious why he castrated himself. Like, I'm assuming it's for political gain and to move his way up in the imperial household to be like the advisor to the emperor. I'm assuming that's what it is, that he did it for his own agenda. But I'm like, okay. And maybe he was someone, we don't know any of his backstory yet, but maybe he was someone that despite being handsome came from a very poor upbringing. So there was really no chance of him rising societally in the ranks. So he's like, if I just sacrifice this part of myself, I can have that. Interesting, right? But yeah, they can't figure out what's wrong with the baby and with her. And it's the poison powder, which, yeah, and what's hilarious about that is we've recently had recalls on powders right now in my own country because of poisonous materials. I'm like, it's been a couple hundred years. You'd think we'd figure that out by now, right? But yeah, the thing about the physician being assigned to only the concubine that has the male heir, again, we've seen that throughout history. It's, the patriarchy. Who cares about the princess? But we got to save that male heir. But they all say it's a curse. And I like that Mao Mao kind of dispenses that. And she's like, there are no such thing as curses. It's just actual events and things happening. Which is, yeah, interesting. So the emperor has had 3 other children and they all grew weak and passed away, presumably about the face powder as well. The wet nurse that was taking care of them had the powder on her. So it got transferred to the baby and they all died. But here you have the concubine who's also using the powder and she's hurting herself as well. That all makes sense, right? But then there was the one that was Lihua, and then Gyokyo. Gyokyo, the one lady. And I like that they're, of course, pink and purple, like those two colors side by side. I'm very curious to see how their political struggle is going to go, how that's going to end up. That should be interesting. But yeah, Mao Mao, of course, is like, the curiosity she has gets the better of her. And she's like, oh, I don't want to get involved. I'm trying to lie low. But she's like, I don't think it's poison. I think it's something else. I don't think it's deliberate. I think it's something else. And it's like, yeah, girl, figure it out. And then she figures it out. And she's like, but how do I tell them? And they have this confrontation out there in the street. And all the eunuchs are like, what are we going to do? Jinshi, help us out. Jinshi seems to be like the head eunuch of them all, that's trying to like keep everything kosher between them. And I like that Mao Mao calls out the physician, being like, this guy don't know what he's talking about. He has no clue. But yeah, the death of infants, headache, stomachache, nausea. She's like, how do I tell them? And so then we see Jinshi notice her talking and move past. Jinshi looks like one of the protagonists in every Danmai that I've read so far. I'm on board so hard with a dynamic and relationship between Mao Mao and Jinshi, because one, you have a female writer writing this female character who is subverting gender expectations and is an apothecary. She has like an attitude that is not, her demeanor and attitude is not like that of the stereotypical female protagonist. Like you see female protagonists even in series like, I just finished Puella Magi Madoka Magica, and you see she's like, I'm just upbeat, happy girl. Mao Mao ain't like that. Mao Mao's like, oh shit, what am I doing? Like, which is so much more realistic, right? And so you have her, who I could not see in a stereotypical heterosexual relationship in this series, and her being like, ew, get away from me, especially in this very patriarchal culture. In this story, I could see her being like, oh, no, thank you. You want me to just be pretty and have babies? Gross. I get that's, that completely strips her of all of her curiosity and intrigue to move forward. But then you have Jinshi, who cannot have babies with her. He can't have sex with her. I mean, he can technically help her in ways that is not involving penetration, but they could have a relationship and it be not based on sex organs, but instead based on their mutual understanding of each other, their intellectual compatibility, their personality, everything. I was like, yes, please. I was like, have a relationship between a male and female character that is not based on sexual attraction. I'm like, absolutely. Yes, please. Give me this. I'm totally down for this platonic relationship between them that could develop and all the things we could get from it. 100%. I'm like, yes, I want this. So I'm very curious about their relationship and how it's going to go. But yeah, so Mao Mao tries to tell both women what to do. And we see, now that is the concubine, right? Yeah, she doesn't have all of her gear on, but she sees the flower with the note attached to it, and she tosses it down. Now the question is, did she read the note or not? I don't think she read the note. I think she just brushed it away, which makes it kind of her fault that the baby died. Again, that scene is horrific, right? Such a horrific scene. And then, yeah, meanwhile, the one woman saved her baby because she listened to the note, which I think says a lot about each of their personalities. And so Jinshi's like, okay, I think I figured out what to do. So yeah, I love how he gathers them all together and to weed her out. I like that the one man, with the freckles, because that's Jinshi remembered the freckles. And the one other eunuch is like, she's the one that has freckles. And he's like, okay. She also had the tear in her skirt that she sewed up, showing that she had tore off a piece to use for the writing. And so I love how he tricks her. He's like, if you can read this, don't move. And she's the only one that knows how to read, so she has to stay behind. I love it. And so he makes her go with her to see the lady in waiting. And poor Mao Mao, who wanted to keep a low profile, is no longer allowed to do that. And she says, you are my baby's savior. And I like that Mao Mao's like, I don't want to get beheaded for lying, which could very much happen. And so then he's like, basically, you have no reason to not tell the truth at this point. And she decides to make her lady in waiting, which I'm like, I love the idea of Mao Mao rising up the ranks. I love the idea of Mao Mao rising up the ranks and being able to be this apothecary. I'm very worried about the bullshit she's probably going to go through in this position. But if she has Jinshi helping her, I'm on board with this. I like this Sherlock and Watson style relationship that I think they both have the potential to develop with one another. I think that'll be really cool. I'm excited about that. So then we have this sequence where she talks about the courtesans. She talks who were using high-end powder in the brothels where I grew up, right? So most of them were poisoned by it and lost their lives. Was her mom a concubine? I don't know. Her dad seemed really old. Was her dad like an adoptive father? Because she doesn't look anything like her dad. And so I like that we see, okay, again, the older woman and then the concubines dying. And we see her like, they tried to trade life for beauty and lost both. That line got me, yeah. Didn't work. So interesting. And then she sees the poison on her, she clutches her arm. So I'm like, is she like her whole reason for being apothecary to try and find ways to keep the women around her from becoming poisoned and dying? Because then we saw this woman with the green hair looking like she was about to die. Was that her mom? Was that who she was? I used to be an apothecary, so I know a few things about poisons. I feel like it's tied to her mother's death, which I guess we'll see more information about later on. So then the one concubine, Gokyo, she says that it's a sin to be ignorant. I should have paid more attention. And Jinshi's like, if I had noticed sooner, I could have possibly saved the prince's life as well. I like that the one concubine, Gyokyo, she seems like she genuinely wants to help, and then the other one, she's just jealous and bitter. And so that's interesting. And she's like, what can I do for you? And they're both like, oh, you're going to be my lady in waiting. You're going to help me because you're smart and I don't want you to just be a laundry girl. And so then Mao Mao's like, oh. And the narrator says, there are some things that Mao Mao cannot hold back. Curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, and just a smidgen of a sense of justice. Oh, I love it. I love it. It took me a while in the episode to warm up to Mao Mao because she's so unconventional for what I feel like as a female protagonist, but I automatically am like, yes, no, I get her now. I'm on board with her. Yes, please. I'm all here for it. Yes. And she's like, well, damn it. I was supposed to keep a low profile. And thus Mao Mao became a lady in waiting of the concubine Gyokyo, recipient of the emperor's love. Which I think is going to be a big deal because Gyokyo, I think, is going to be targeted by the other concubine that lost her son because she's bitter about it for obvious reasons, and that Mao Mao is going to have to be employed to help make sure that she doesn't die. All the while getting closer to Jinshi. I'm super excited. Meanwhile, though, and maybe she'll end up helping figure out why these men are dropping dead from poison in their kanji. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm very excited. I know that several of you who probably have done research with this series are going to have things in the comments down below for me to talk about, which I'm super excited about. And I feel like I'm going to probably have to do research as we go through each episode and talk about it as well, even if it's just bare bones. So that's very exciting to me. But yeah, it took me a second to warm up to this episode because I was like, I've been watching like male written fantasy for a little bit, and I was like, oh wait, awesome, we're back to like MXTX land. Great. So I'm super excited about this. I'm excited to see what we get, the relationship between Jinshi and Mao Mao developing. I'm super excited for that as well. So I can't wait to see where this goes. So with that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and I'll be back real soon for episode 2 of the Apothecary Diaries.